The door swung open before Grace Talbot even had a chance to knock a second time, and the two children standing in the frame looked at her not with the cautious suspicion she had expected from strangers, but with something that stopped her breath entirely. They looked at her like they had been waiting, like they had drawn her face from memory and posted it behind their eyes, and now here she was, arriving at last, and the universe had finally kept its promise to them. The boy was perhaps 9 years old, dark-haired and solemn, with his father's jaw already squared into something stubborn and proud. The girl beside him was maybe 6, copper-curled and wide-eyed, clutching a rag doll to her chest as though she were protecting it or perhaps being protected by it. Neither of them said a word. They simply stared at Grace with that unbearable, open-faced recognition, and Grace felt something crack inside her chest that she had kept sealed shut for 3 years. She had come to Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882 with one purpose only. She needed a room. She had $47, a carpetbag full of sensible clothing, and a name on a scrap of paper that the station master in Abilene had pressed into her palm. Boone Farm, he had said. Henry Boone takes in boarders sometimes. Widow man, good reputation. You'll be safe there while you find your footing. She had not come for children who looked at her like she was a miracle. She had not come to feel anything at all. And yet standing on that warped porch with the April wind pulling at the hem of her gray traveling dress, and these two children drinking her in like water in a drought, Grace Talbot felt the locked door inside herself shudder against its hinges for the first time since the betrayal that had sent her westward in the first place. "Is your father home?" she managed. The boy nodded slowly. He had not blinked once. "I've come about a room," Grace added, as if explaining herself to two small children required justification. Maybe it did. There was a gravity to their attention that demanded honesty. The girl tilted her head and said very quietly, "I told Eli you'd come today." Grace felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. "You did?" "I dreamed about you," the girl said simply, the way children state facts that adults have forgotten how to believe. That was when the door opened wider behind them, and Grace Talbot looked up, and Henry Boone stepped into the light, and the careful, manageable world she had constructed around herself since Philadelphia broke apart like dry clay. He was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something rough and unremarkable, the practical shelter of a practical stranger. Instead, she found a man of perhaps 34 or 35, tall and lean, with the kind of tired around his eyes that comes not from laziness but from carrying too much for too long. His dark hair needed cutting. His shirt was clean. His hands, gripping the doorframe above his children's heads, were the hands of someone who worked the earth and asked nothing back from it except enough to survive. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. Not welcome, exactly. Not suspicion, either. Something more complicated. Something that looked strangely like recognition, and the fact that she felt it mirrored in her own chest was the most frightening thing that had happened to her since she had boarded the westbound train in the first place. "You're here about the room," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Grace said. "I'm Grace Talbot." A long pause. The wind moved between them. "Henry Boone," he said at last. "Come in, then." 3 weeks earlier, Grace had been sitting in the reading room of the Ladies' Relief Society of Philadelphia, pretending to read a pamphlet about temperance while actually wondering whether she would have enough courage to do what she had already decided to do. The courage question had been answered definitively at 10 o'clock that morning, when she had walked into the offices of Talbot and Marsh, the law firm her late father had founded, and which her former fiancé, Edmund Marsh, had inherited through a combination of legal maneuvering and calculated romance that still made her stomach turn. Edmund had not expected to see her. He had expected her to remain quietly in the small house on Locust Street, accepting the settlement his lawyers had sent and disappearing from his life, the way women were supposed to disappear when men of means decided they were inconvenient. Edmund had badly underestimated Grace Talbot's capacity for righteous fury. She had walked into his office and placed a stack of letters on his mahogany desk. Her father's letters. Letters in which Edmund had, over the course of 4 years, systematically advised her aging father to restructure his estate in ways that had, upon the father's death, positioned Edmund perfectly to absorb the firm's most valuable assets. Letters that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Edmund's engagement to Grace had been a business strategy. She had watched his face go through 4 distinct colors. "You could go to the papers," he had said finally, his voice quiet and controlled in the way of men who believe control is always available to them. "I could," Grace had agreed. "But you won't," he said, "because your name is attached to mine in this city, and whatever damages me also damages you." And that was the trap. That was the hidden trap she had spent 3 months slowly recognizing, the way you recognize a room you've been locked in only after you've touched every wall. He was right. In Philadelphia in 1882, a woman did not emerge unscathed from a public scandal, even one in which she was the victim. She would be the cautionary tale. She would be the foolish woman who had not seen it coming. So Grace had looked at Edmund Marsh for a long moment, and then she had picked up her father's letters and she had walked out. She had gone home and packed a bag. She had written to the Society for the Relief of Western Settlers, an organization that connected educated women with respectable employment opportunities in frontier towns, school teaching, bookkeeping, nursing, and the like. Within 10 days she had 3 options. She had chosen Redemption Creek because the name felt like a dare. The train journey had taken 9 days. During those 9 days, Grace had sat in her berth and methodically rebuilt herself from the inside. She had named every secret she had been keeping from herself. The one about how she had known, somewhere beneath her good intentions, that Edmund's interest had always been slightly too convenient, too well-timed, arriving precisely when her father's health began to decline. She had known and she had chosen not to know, and that choice, that willing blindness, felt more shameful to her than being deceived. She was done with blindness. She was done with needing to be wanted so badly that she ignored what was plainly visible. She was 28 years old. She was educated, capable, and entirely alone. She intended to stay alone long enough to trust herself again. That was the plan. That was the entire plan. A room, a job, herself. Not 2 children who looked at her like she had always been coming. Not their father and his exhausted, careful eyes. Henry Boone's house was a good house. It had been built 15 years earlier, during the years when Redemption Creek had been growing with the optimistic swagger of all Texas towns that believed the cattle trade would make them permanent. The main room was large and clean, with a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and a long oak table that had clearly been made for a family larger than 3. There were curtains in the windows, blue-checked cotton, and Grace noticed immediately that they had been hemmed with someone else's hands, precise and skilled in a way that spoke of habit, of a woman who had sat at that window many times and sewn in the afternoon light. The children's mother, dead according to the station master. 2 years gone, he had said. Fever, he thought. Nobody in town liked to say it plain. Grace did not ask, but she noticed the curtains. She noticed the absence behind them. Henry showed her the room with a businesslike efficiency that seemed to cost him something. It was at the back of the house, small but solid, with a window that faced east and a brass-framed bed that had been recently aired, the blankets still carrying the faint smell of the outdoor line. There was a washstand and a mirror and a hook on the back of the door for her coat. "The rate is $2 a week," Henry said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Includes 2 meals a day, breakfast and supper. You take your noon meal in town if you're working. I don't run a restaurant." "That's fine," Grace said. "The children are my concern, not yours," he said, and there was something sharpened in it, a warning under the practical words. "They're not entertainment. They're not pets. If you stay here, you give them friendly courtesy and you don't make promises you won't keep." Grace looked at him steadily. "I understand. Do you?" He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, Because my daughter took a liking to the last boarder we had, a school teacher who stayed 3 months. She cried for a week when the woman left." He paused. "Maddie doesn't get attached easily, but when she does." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'll be honest with them," Grace said. "I don't know how long I'll stay. That's the truth, and I'll tell them that truth if they ask." Something moved in his expression. "That's the most straightforward thing anyone said to me in some time," he admitted. Grace set her bag on the bed. "I'll take the room." The first days were careful and measured, two people at careful distances, the children threading between them like the thread on a loom, giving structure to something that would otherwise have been formless. Eli, she learned, was 9 years old and deeply serious about three things: the mechanical workings of his father's plow equipment, the question of whether birds could actually feel cold the way humans did, and whether the Apache people who had once moved through the territory had left anything behind in the Red Rock Hills north of town. He spoke to Grace with the grave, slightly formal courtesy of a child who had decided, on some interior evidence, that she was worthy of his best manners. Maddie, at 6, was a different creature entirely. She had her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's, Grace assumed, copper curls, and she possessed a quality that Grace could only call second sight, not supernatural exactly, but a relentless perceptiveness that made you feel X-rayed when she turned her full attention to you. She had, within the first hour of Grace's arrival, climbed into the large chair by the fire and announced, "You're sad about something, but you don't cry." Grace had looked at the child for a long moment. "That's perceptive of you," she said at last. "Mama cried at the window sometimes," Maddie said matter-of-factly. "You don't cry at windows, but you look at them the same way." Henry, who was carrying a split log to the fireplace at that moment, had gone very still. Grace said gently, "Sometimes being sad and crying are two different things." Maddie considered this with the thoroughness of a small philosopher and then nodded, apparently satisfied. "I'm going to show you my rabbit," she said, sliding from the chair and taking Grace's hand as though the subject were closed, and the next 15 minutes were spent being introduced to a brown rabbit named General, who lived in a hutch behind the barn and regarded Grace with the absolute indifference of all rabbits everywhere. But Henry's stillness stayed with her. She thought about it that night lying in the brass-framed bed, the spring wind moving against the east-facing window, the house quiet around her. There was a grief in this house that lived in the walls, in the blue-checked curtains, in Henry Boone's careful distances, and it was not the grief of a man who had moved on. It was the grief of a man who had simply learned to carry it, the way you carry a stone in your pocket until it becomes so familiar you forget it's there. Grace knew that kind of grief. She had a different shape of it, but she recognized the weight. She had been in Redemption Creek 4 days when she found work. The town had a general store owned by a man named Harold Watts, who was enthusiastic, perpetually overwhelmed, and in desperate need of someone who could read, write, keep accounts, and deal with the postal correspondence that piled up in the back room like unchecked sin. Grace presented herself at 8 in the morning on her 4th day, and by 10 o'clock she was employed at a wage of $8 a month, which in 1882 Texas was modest but respectable. The work suited her. It was concrete and solvable in a way that the previous 3 years of her life had not been, and there was something deeply satisfying about the physical order of it. The accounts balanced, the postal orders filed, the shelves organized with a logic that Mr. Watts described, with genuine awe, as miraculous. She walked the half-mile to town each morning and returned by 6 each evening, and Henry always had supper on the table when she came in, a fact she noticed and did not remark upon for the first week, because she suspected he would tell her it was simply part of the arrangement. On the evening of the 8th day, she came in to find him swearing quietly at the stove, a pot of something that had gone wrong in some fundamental way balanced at the edge of disaster, and Maddie sitting at the table with her chin in her hands watching him with the expression of someone who has seen this particular drama before and is comfortable with its outcome. "Is there something I can do?" Grace asked. "No," Henry said flatly. "Papa burned the beans again," Maddie announced. "I can see that," Grace said. "I haven't burned them yet," Henry said. The beans burned 30 seconds later. There was a moment of charged silence, and then, against everything she had planned and every wall she had built on the train ride west, Grace Talbot laughed. She laughed fully and genuinely, the kind of laugh that bypasses all your careful defenses because it arrives too fast. And when she looked at Henry Boone, she found him looking at her with an expression so unguarded and surprised and wondering that she had to look away. "There's ham in the cold box," he said at last, his voice slightly rougher than it had been before, "and cornbread from this morning." "I can make eggs," Grace offered, "if you have them." "We have eggs," Eli said from the doorway, appearing with the timing of someone who had been lurking nearby. "General's pen has 4 hens." "General also has hens?" Grace asked. "General is the rabbit. The hens don't have names," Maddie said with the gravity of someone explaining an important taxonomic distinction. Henry set the ruined pot to the side and said, without quite meeting Grace's eyes, "If you wouldn't mind." "I don't mind," Grace said. She made eggs with the ham and the leftover cornbread, and the 4 of them sat at the long oak table and ate together. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And it was also the most dangerous thing Grace had experienced since Philadelphia, because it felt like something that had always been supposed to happen, and Grace knew better than to trust feelings like that. She knew better, and she felt it anyway. The Saturday market in Redemption Creek happened every week in the open space beside the livery, and on the second Saturday of Grace's stay, Maddie appeared at her door at 7 in the morning and announced that they were going. It was not an invitation so much as a logistical statement of fact, the way Maddie communicated most things. "Does your father know you're here?" Grace asked. "He said I could ask you," Maddie said. "He said to say you don't have to come if you don't want to." Grace looked down at the girl. "But you want me to come?" Maddie's expression was transparent. "I want to show you Mrs. Rodriguez's tamales," she said, "and the man who sells the glass beads, and the woman with the blue scarves. There's a lot to show you." Henry was in the yard sharpening a blade when Grace came out with Maddie's hand in hers and Eli already mounted on the fence post ready to jump down, and he watched them come toward him with something in his face that he immediately rearranged into something more neutral when he noticed Grace looking. "You don't have to take them to the market," he said. "I know," Grace said. "I'd like to." Another one of those pauses that seemed to last longer than their actual duration. "I'll come in about an hour," he said. "I need to finish this." "Take your time," Grace said, and they set off down the road, Maddie chattering about tamales and Eli walking with his hands in his pockets and his serious eyes cataloging the world. The market was lively and warm with the smell of wood smoke and food and horses, the usual texture of a frontier town commerce day, and Grace found herself genuinely charmed by it in a way she had not expected. Philadelphia markets had been efficient and somewhat anonymous. This one had the character of a community that knew itself, people stopping to talk for real, arguments conducted in the open, children running underfoot, old men playing cards on a blanket by the water trough. Mrs. Rodriguez's tamales were, as advertised, extraordinary. They had been there perhaps 40 minutes when Grace heard a voice she did not recognize, speaking too loudly in the way of men who are performing for an audience, and she turned to see a man she had not met yet, wide-shouldered and prosperous-looking, with a vest that spoke of money and a manner that spoke of a man who expected his money to speak for him. "Well," he said, looking at Grace with the particular assessment of a man who treats all women as inventory to be evaluated, "I heard there was new blood in town. Didn't hear she'd be this pretty." Grace met his gaze without expression. "Good morning," she said. "Cal Draper," the man said, extending his hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to that name meaning something. "I own the Double D Ranch east of here, about 4,000 acres, in case that's interesting to you." "Grace Talbot," Grace said. "I work at Watt's General Store, in case that's interesting to you." Something flashed in his eyes, amusement or irritation, it was hard to say. "A working woman, that's something." Is it? Grace said pleasantly. I find it quite ordinary. Cal Draper laughed, but it did not reach his eyes. You're staying at Boone's place, are you? I'm renting a room there, yes. Boone's a good man, Draper said, in the tone of a man granting a generous assessment of someone he felt superior to. Bad luck, losing his wife that way. Man needs to move forward. He paused, and the pause was laden with a specific unpleasantness. Course, a woman of your quality might not want to settle for boarding house life when there are better options. Grace felt the slow heat of carefully managed anger begin at the back of her neck. I'm not settling for anything, Mr. Draper, she said. I'm building something, there's a difference. Draper's eyes narrowed. Before he could respond, Maddie reappeared at Grace's elbow, looking at the man with open dislike. Papa says Mr. Draper talks too much, she announced. A beat of shocked silence, and then Eli materialized on Grace's other side, presenting a unified front with the tactical awareness of a much older person. Your father's here, Grace asked, not taking her eyes off Draper. He came early, Eli said. He's at the hardware stall. Grace looked at Draper and smiled, the kind of smile that carries no warmth but considerable precision. Lovely to meet you, she said, and turned away with the children. Henry was indeed at the hardware stall, examining a length of chain, and he straightened when he saw them coming, reading something in the set of Grace's shoulders before she had said a word. His eyes went to Draper's, retreating back across the market square. He bother you? He asked low. Nothing I couldn't handle, Grace said. I know you could handle it, Henry said, and the simplicity of that acknowledgement, no qualifier, no protective disclaimer, just the statement of a fact he had apparently already decided, moved through Grace like a current. He's been sniffing around anyone he thinks might be available since his wife left him last year. His wife left him? Grace asked. Packed her bags on a Tuesday, Henry said. I heard she went to her sister in San Antonio and hasn't been back. He paused. Nobody was particularly surprised. No, Grace said, thinking of the man's inventory-assessing eyes. I don't suppose they were. Henry glanced at her then, a sidelong look that seemed to be measuring something. You're not scared of men like that, he said. I'm cautious of men like that, Grace corrected. There's a difference. What happened? He asked, and then immediately, you don't have to say. A man I trusted showed me that trust can be a trap, Grace said, more directly than she had said it to anyone, perhaps ever. I learned to read the signals I used to ignore. Henry was quiet for a moment. Is that why you came west? Partly, Grace said. And partly because I needed to discover what I was capable of when I was only responsible to myself. He turned to look at her fully then, and there was something very direct in his gaze, something that did not look away or soften. How is that going? He asked. Surprisingly well, Grace said, and she meant it. The spring deepened. April passed into May, and the bluebonnets on the hillsides north of town were extraordinary. A rolling blue wash that Maddie declared looked like the sky had fallen down to rest. Grace was beginning to find the rhythms of Redemption Creek pleasant in the way of something you have not expected to suit you but does. The early mornings in the store with the accounts spread before her and the coffee from the tin on the back stove. The walk home in the long evening light. The supper table where conversation had, gradually, without announcement, become something more than polite. Henry was different than she had initially read him. The careful distance was real, but it was a discipline, not a nature. His nature, she was learning, was curious, and a little dry and capable of a humor so quiet it sometimes took her a full 30 seconds to realize she had been made to laugh. He read, more than she would have expected, the Redemption Creek Courier and whatever books came through the post office. And once she came home to find him at the long table with Eli's natural history primer open before him, and both of them engaged in a serious argument about whether armadillos were more closely related to turtles or to possums. She had her own dark past and he had his, and neither of them reached for the others, but they were both aware, with a growing and slightly alarmed clarity, that they were doing something they had not agreed to do. They were beginning to know each other. The first time they were truly alone together was an accident. It was a Wednesday evening in late May, 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, and Eli and Maddie were both asleep. Grace had come out to the porch because the night was warm, and the smell of the prairie in spring was something she was not over yet. The sage and the distant water, and the enormous dark press of the Texas sky. Henry was already there, leaning on the porch rail with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he turned when he heard the door and then, finding it was her, turned back to the dark again. Grace sat in the porch chair. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was, she noticed, not uncomfortable. They had that already, the ability to be quiet in the same space without its being awkward. "Eli asked me today if you were staying," Henry said finally. Grace felt the careful weight of the question. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." A pause. "What would you tell him?" Grace considered. "I'd tell him the honest thing, which is that I don't have plans to leave, but I didn't have plans to stay either, so I'm not sure how much my plans count for." Henry made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. "That's honest. You asked for honest." "I did." He turned slightly, not fully facing her, just enough that the lamplight from the window caught the side of his face. "Why Redemption Creek? Of all the places?" Grace told him. Not all of it, but enough: the law firm, her father, Edmund Marsh, the letters, the trap of a public scandal that would have unmade her in the city where her name meant something only because it was attached to a man's. She told it plainly, without the self-pity she had been afraid of finding in it, and he listened the way she had not expected a man to listen, fully, without offering solutions or interrupting or looking uncomfortable at a woman's direct account of her own wronging. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You took the letters," he said at last. "I kept copies," Grace said. "I left the originals on his desk." Because I didn't want his ruin," Grace said. "I wanted my departure. There's a difference." Henry looked at her then fully, and something crossed his face that was complicated and warm and carefully policed. "You said that to me before," he said, "about the difference between things." "Precision matters," Grace said. "Most of the worst mistakes I've made came from imprecise thinking." "Most of the worst things that happen to people," Henry said, "come from not calling things what they are." A pause. The night around them was enormous and still. "Your wife," Grace said, and then stopped, because she had not meant to say it. "Margaret," Henry said. The name sat in the air between them, careful and sad. "She got sick in the autumn of '80. We thought it was just the seasonal cold. By November," he stopped. "The doctor in Abilene said there was nothing to do. We had 3 months. Grace did not say she was sorry. She had learned that sorry in the face of grief was often less a comfort than a way for the speaker to manage their own discomfort. Instead, she said, "Maddie has her eyes." Henry turned to look at her sharply. "In that portrait in the hall," Grace said, "the woman has Maddie's eyes." Henry's throat moved. "Yes," he said, "she does." "She must have been remarkable," Grace said. "She was," Henry said quietly. "She was also lonely out here. She missed her family in Missouri, and she never said it enough, and I never asked enough." He paused. "That's a thing I carry." "The things we didn't ask," Grace said. "Yes, I know that category of regret." "Does it get lighter?" he asked, and there was something naked in the question that she thought had surprised even him. Grace considered this seriously. "It changes shape," she said finally. "It doesn't get lighter exactly. It just becomes a part of you instead of a wound. You integrate it." She paused. "At least that's what I'm told. I'm still working on the integration." Henry looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked back at the dark prairie and said, "The children like you." "I like them," Grace said. He stopped, tried again. "That's not nothing," he said, "to me." Grace felt the careful weight of those words, the way a man like Henry Boone expressed things in measured understatements that were worth translating. "I know," she said. They stayed on the porch until the coffee was cold and the coyotes had started their distant choir. And when Grace finally went inside and lay in the brass-framed bed listening to the house settle around her, she acknowledged, with the precision she had promised herself, that she was in some danger. Not the kind of danger she had been in with Edmund Marsh. A different kind entirely. The kind that was not forced on you but chosen. She was not sure which kind was more frightening. It was Cal Draper who forced the issue, as men like Cal Draper always do, by mistaking a woman's courtesy for an invitation and a man's decency for weakness. He came to the store 3 times in the second week of June, each time finding a reason to linger at Grace's counter, each time extending his stay by degrees, each time testing boundaries with the practiced subtlety of a man who has learned to push softly until he finds the give. Grace managed him with civil precision, and she said nothing to Henry because she was not a woman who required a man's intervention in her professional life. She said nothing until the Saturday morning when Draper came to the store before opening, knocked on the back door where the stock entrance was, and told Grace, with a directness she had not expected from him, that he intended to court her and that he thought she should know it. Grace stood in the doorway of the stock room with an invoice in her hand and looked at the man. "Mr. Draper," she said, "I appreciate the directness. I'll match it. I'm not available to be courted." His face went through several stages. "You're committed to someone." "I'm committed to myself," Grace said. "At the moment that takes all my available attention." Draper studied her. "Is it Boone?" he asked. "This isn't about anyone but me," Grace said firmly. "Boone's got nothing," Draper said, and now the pleasant surface was gone and there was something harder underneath. 2 kids, a mid-size spread, and a reputation for keeping to himself. That's not much of a life for a woman like you. "I'll make my own decisions about what constitutes a life," Grace said. Draper's jaw tightened. "I'm a patient man, Miss Talbot." "I'm a consistent woman, Mr. Draper," Grace replied. "Good morning." She did not tell Henry. Henry found out 3 days later from Joe Alderman at the livery, who had heard it from Harold Watts himself, who had witnessed the exchange through the stockroom doorway while reaching for a barrel of nails. Redemption Creek was, like all small towns, a community in which privacy was something you carried inside you because the outside world offered none. Henry came home from town that evening with a thunderous set to his jaw that Eli noticed immediately and catalogued without comment. Grace was at the table writing a letter to a former colleague in Philadelphia, and she looked up when Henry came in and read his face with the fluency she was developing in him. "It wasn't important enough to mention," she said before he could speak. "Watts told me Draper came to the back door," Henry said. "Yes. That's a deliberate discourtesy," Henry said, "coming to a woman's place of work before opening at the back entrance." "I handled it," Grace said. "I know you did," Henry said, and she caught the echo of the market square. He always said that first. He always acknowledged her competence before his own concern. That small, consistent thing did something to her that she was having increasing difficulty categorizing as anything other than what it was. "He'll come back." "Probably," Grace agreed. "He's been trying to buy my south pasture for 3 years," Henry said, sitting across the table from her with the abrupt heaviness of a man who has been carrying something and needs to set it down. "He wants the water rights. The creek runs through it." He paused. "I've said no 3 times. He's not accustomed to no." "I noticed that quality in him," Grace said. Henry looked at her across the table. "I want to say something to you," he said carefully, "and I want you to know that I understand completely if you disagree." Grace set down her pen. "You are not mine to protect," Henry said. "You have made that clear and I respect it. But I am also a man who is finding it increasingly difficult to sit quietly while someone deliberately pursues a woman who has been clear with him, and while I know that is my problem to manage." He stopped. "I don't know what I'm saying." "Yes, you do," Grace said quietly. A silence. "Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name without the formality of Miss Talbot, and it sounded different in his mouth. It sounded like something he had been saying privately for some time and had finally let out into the open air. "Henry," she said back, with the same careful weight. "I'm not going to ask you anything tonight," he said. "I'm not in a position to ask you anything. I've been," he searched for the word, "closed for a long time, and I don't think I've fully understood until very recently that it was a choice and not a condition." He looked at the table. "That was not a choice Margaret would have wanted for me. She was clear about that. Near the end, she was very clear. Grace felt the ache in the room, the particular ache of two people who have both been badly handled by time and chance and their own hidden choices, sitting across a table from each other and beginning to be honest about it. "I came here to find my own ground again," Grace said. "I need to know I'm standing on something real, not something offered to me. Not something I'm taking because it's warm and safe, something I'm choosing deliberately with open eyes." "Yes," Henry said immediately, as if he understood this completely. "I'm not saying no to you," Grace said, and she felt her own precision working, the careful tool she had built from wreckage. "I'm saying not yet, because I don't fully trust my own judgment yet, and you deserve someone whose judgment you can trust." Henry looked at her with something that was deep and warm and patient. "I can wait," he said. "You don't know how long," Grace said. "No," he agreed, "but I can wait anyway." They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight, and Grace felt the shape of that moment fix itself permanently somewhere inside her, the way certain things do, the way you know even as they happen that you will carry them always. A man who did not push. A man who acknowledged her capacity and waited in it. After everything she had come from, the hidden motives and the calculated warmth, that patience felt like the most radical thing she had ever been offered. She picked up her pen and went back to her letter. Henry went to the stove to check on the beans, which were, for once, not burning. June moved toward July. The heat settled over Redemption Creek like a heavy hand, and the town moved with the slow, determined rhythm of people who have learned to work around the temperature rather than against it. Grace's days had taken on a shape she found deeply satisfying. The work at the store, the walks in the early morning before the heat built, the evenings at the long table where Henry and the children had become, without any formal declaration, simply her people. She wrote to her cousin Ruth in Ohio and told her she had found a situation that suited her. She did not elaborate. Ruth would want details, and Grace was not ready to put this into the kind of words that could be read by someone who had not lived it. She was coming home from the store on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July when she heard the argument from half a block away. It was happening outside the Redemption Creek Land Office, a small building that served as the town's informal courthouse for property matters, and when she rounded the corner, she saw Henry facing Cal Draper with two other men she did not recognize flanking Draper like parentheses. She stopped. Henry's voice was level and very quiet, which she had learned was actually the more dangerous register for him. "You filed a disputed title claim on a property you've never owned and you know it. Surveyors can make errors," Draper said pleasantly. "The creek boundary was always ambiguous." "The boundary was surveyed in '74 and recorded in the county book," Henry said. "There's nothing ambiguous about it." "Old surveys aren't always reliable," Draper said. "I've hired my own man. He sees it differently." Grace stood on the boardwalk and listened, and felt the cold recognition of a trap she had seen before in different clothing. A man with resources deploying them against someone with fewer resources, not because the claim had merit but because the process itself, the time, the cost, the uncertainty, was the weapon. "This is a legal matter for the county judge," Henry said. "I'll address it there." "That could take months," Draper said, "cost you money you might not have, and in the meantime," he paused, letting the pause do its ugly work. "Property in dispute is hard to work, hard to borrow against, hard to be certain about." Henry looked at him for a long moment. "I know what you're doing," he said. "I'm exercising a legal right to clarification," Draper said smoothly. "Nothing more." Henry turned and saw Grace. Something moved in his face, not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of private regret, the regret of a man whose trouble has been witnessed. Grace walked to him directly. "The 1874 survey," she said, "at the land office." Henry looked at her. "You heard." "The records are public," Grace said. "Harold Watts has a copy. He keeps photostat copies of all the county land surveys because he was on the first water rights committee." She looked at Draper. "Mr. Draper, I'm quite good with records. It would be a genuine pleasure to go through everything that's on file regarding this matter. Draper's eyes moved from Grace to Henry and back. "This doesn't concern you, Miss Talbot." "I'm a resident of this property," Grace said. "It concerns me considerably." A pause. Draper's expression went through a recalculation. "I'll be filing with the county judge within the week," Henry said. "We're done here." They walked back toward the store together, and Grace collected the copies of the survey records that Harold Watts produced from a back cabinet with the cheerful efficiency of a man who had been keeping them precisely for this kind of occasion. And that evening, she and Henry spread the papers across the long table, and Eli sat at the end of it and listened with his grave, cataloging attention, while Grace explained to Henry, in clear terms, exactly what was in the record and exactly how it contradicted any claim Draper could possibly make. Henry watched her work. She could feel it, the quality of his attention, which was different from being watched in the way she was accustomed to, the inventory assessment, the measuring. He watched her the way someone watches a person doing something they find genuinely interesting. "You're good at this," he said. "My father was a lawyer," Grace said, without looking up from the papers. "I grew up reading case files at the kitchen table." He believed women should understand the law thoroughly because the law has historically not understood women thoroughly. "He sounds like a good man," Henry said. "He was the best man I knew," Grace said, and the past tense sat quietly between them. "Until he wasn't well enough to protect what he'd built, and then other people made decisions about his legacy that he didn't have the strength left to contest." She smoothed the survey paper flat. "That's the thing about hidden motives. They're most effective against people who are too tired or too trusting to see them." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you for this. I like problems that can be solved with evidence," Grace said simply. Henry filed with the county judge the following Monday. The judge, a small, precise woman named Anita Flores, who had been appointed when the previous judge retired, and who was, according to Harold Watts, absolutely not to be underestimated, reviewed the records Grace had compiled with the survey documents and the historical water rights correspondence and issued a preliminary ruling within a week. Draper's surveyor had, in fact, used a measurement baseline that conflicted with the county record. The claim was dismissed as unfounded pending a final ruling, which the judge made clear she anticipated would confirm the dismissal. Cal Draper did not return to the store. He did not approach Grace again. He passed Henry on the street one morning and did not stop, and Henry watched him go with the expression of a man who is glad something is over and expects it to stay over. Grace made no comment on the victory, which was not hers to claim as such. But that evening, when she set the table for supper, and Maddie came running in from the yard with a fistful of wildflowers she had picked from the field behind the barn, and presented them to Grace with the gravity of a ritual offering. Grace accepted them with the same gravity and put them in the blue crockery pitcher on the windowsill. And Henry came in from the yard and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the flowers in the pitcher and said nothing at all. But his face said something she no longer had any difficulty translating. August arrived and brought with it a dry heat and a county fair in the neighboring town of Harwick, 15 miles east, and Eli spent the week beforehand in an unprecedented state of anticipation, because the fair included a demonstration by the new telegraph company that was extending its line across South Texas, and Eli had decided that electricity was the next great frontier and intended to interrogate the demonstrator thoroughly. The four of them went together. It was an unspoken arrangement, the way most things between Grace and Henry had become, not discussed, but simply settled, the way you settle into a chair that fits you rather than announcing that you have sat down. The fair was hot and bright and smelled of dust and roasting corn and horse, and Maddie held Grace's hand from the moment they arrived, and did not let go for most of the morning, navigating Grace through the stalls with the authority of a very small expedition leader. Eli made his way to the telegraph demonstration with the focused intensity of a scholar, and Henry bought corn from an elderly man selling it from a cart, and ate it standing in the shade with the relaxed ease of a man who had, Grace was beginning to recognize, been holding himself very tight for a very long time and was gradually, carefully, learning to release. They had been there perhaps 2 hours when a girl Maddie's age pulled Maddie away to look at ribbons, and Eli was deep in telegraph conversation with the demonstrator, and Grace and Henry found themselves standing alone at the edge of the fair under a cottonwood tree with the noise of the day happening comfortably around them rather than involving them. "This is the first fair I've come to since Margaret," Henry said. "How does it feel?" Grace asked. He considered it seriously. "Less like an absence," he said. "More like something beginning." Grace did not answer immediately. She looked out at the fair, at the bright colors of the pennants and the sunlit faces of people spending an ordinary good day in the world. She thought about Edmund Marsh, about the days she had moved through after understanding what he had done, the cold mechanical quality of her life then, the sense that she was performing the motions of living while the actual interior of her was sealed off, frozen. She thought about the brass-framed bed in the east-facing room, and the blue-checked curtains and Maddie's hand in hers, and Henry at the stove not burning the beans, and the porch in the spring night. She thought about what it felt like to have been careful and patient and honest with herself, to have waited until she trusted the ground beneath her feet. She turned and looked at Henry Boone and found him already looking at her, and she said, "I think I'm ready." He blinked. Something very careful happened in his face, the careful managing of something he clearly did not want to manage wrong. "Grace." "Not a question," she said. "A statement. I came here to find my ground. I found it." She held his gaze with the full precision she had earned. "I'm standing on it right now." Henry set down his corn and looked at her with an expression that was so entirely undefended that it almost hurt to look at directly, the way the sun does when you've been inside too long. "I told you I could wait," he said. "You did," Grace said. "That was the thing, Henry. You waited. You never pushed. You never tried to convince me or maneuver me or make me feel that standing on my own was a problem you needed to solve. It wasn't a strategy," he said. "It was just." He searched for it. "I watched you these past months. What you are. I wasn't going to push against that." "I know," Grace said. "That's why I'm standing here telling you I'm ready." Henry looked at her for one more long moment, as if making certain she was real, and then he reached out and took her hand, and it was the simplest thing in the world, his hand around hers, standing under a cottonwood at the Harwick County Fair on a hot August day in 1882, and Grace Talbot felt the last frozen thing inside her break loose and flow free. They stood like that for a while, just that, his hand in hers, the fair going on around them, not needing anything more complicated than that for the moment. The simplicity of it was its power. Eli appeared between them 20 minutes later, full of electrical theory, and looked at their joined hands with the unsurprisable expression of a 9-year-old who has been paying attention, and said only, "We should look at the horses." Grace laughed, and Henry laughed, and they went to look at the horses. He did not kiss her that day. He was not a man for public declarations of that particular kind. But that evening on the drive back in the wagon, with Maddie asleep against Grace's shoulder and Eli dropped off against his father's arm, Henry reached across the sleeping children and found Grace's hand in the dark, and held it the whole 15 miles home under the enormous Texas sky. And that was, Grace thought, its own kind of declaration. September brought the first cool edge to the mornings and a quality of golden light that transformed the Texas landscape into something genuinely beautiful, and with it came a change in the household that felt earned and natural and deeply right. Henry no longer maintained the careful formal distance. He sat with Grace in the evenings and talked about the farm and about books, and about the strange, difficult history of this land. The Apache displacement that Eli had been researching with his characteristic thoroughness, and about which Henry had strong views grounded in a justice he quietly but firmly maintained. "This land was taken," he told his children at the supper table one evening, with Grace sitting beside him, And the people it was taken from were not compensated and not treated with any human dignity. And that is a wrong that does not become right just because time passes. We should know it and we should say it. Eli received this with solemn confirmation of views he had apparently already developed. Maddie asked what compensated meant. Grace explained it, and then Henry told the story of the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache in South Texas with a directness that did not soften the injustice for the sake of comfort. And Grace sat there listening to this man teach his children to see the world clearly and honestly, and felt something for him that went so deep it had no language yet. Henry kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening at the end of September, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and they had been sitting on the porch with the autumn air around them, and the conversation had gradually dissolved into the comfortable silence they had always been good at. And then Henry had turned to her and taken her face in his hands with such careful deliberateness that it was almost a question even before it happened, and she answered the question by leaning in. And the kiss was gentle and warm and certain, the way things are when they have been built on ground that holds. They pulled back and looked at each other, and Henry said very quietly, "I was afraid for a long time that I wouldn't feel this again." "Feel what?" Grace asked, though she knew. "Like there was something ahead," he said. "Not just maintenance, actual forward." He touched her cheek. "Something worth moving toward." Grace turned her head and pressed her lips to his palm, a gesture so tender it surprised her, coming from herself, the careful defended self she had arrived with. "There's something ahead," she said against his hand. Henry brought her a wildflower the next morning, a late autumn chicory bloom, small and blue, and placed it on the breakfast table beside her cup without a word. And Maddie saw it and burst into a smile of such absolute triumph that she could barely contain it. And Eli looked at the flower, and then at his father, and then at Grace, and said simply, "I thought so," with the satisfaction of a small scientist whose hypothesis has been confirmed. The courtship, such as it was in Redemption Creek, was quiet and unhurried and conducted mostly at home, because home was where they both felt it most truly, and because Henry Boone was not a man for performance. He took Grace riding on Sunday mornings, the two of them out in the early light before the town was fully awake, out past the creek and the water oak grove, and up into the red rock hills that Eli had told Grace were full of history, and those mornings became a kind of sanctuary. He told her about Margaret on those rides, slowly, in pieces, not with the weight of unprocessed grief, but with the clean, honest quality of remembrance. Margaret had been funny. Margaret had made a garden that produced vegetables with an almost aggressive enthusiasm. Margaret had sung to the children in a voice that was not technically good, but was so warmly committed to the project that it didn't matter. Margaret had wanted a piano, and they had never managed to afford one. "There's a piano in the school hall," Grace said. "The school teacher, Miss Porter, she told me anyone can use it on Saturday evenings when the school is closed." Henry looked at her. "You think I should?" "I think Maddie might like it," Grace said carefully, "if she has her mother's relationship to music." Henry was quiet for a moment. "She hums," he said, "constantly, while she feeds the rabbit and while she does her writing practice. She hums everything." "Yes," Grace said, "I've noticed." They took Maddie to the school hall on the following Saturday evening, and Grace sat with the child at the piano and picked out the notes of a song she remembered from her own girlhood. And Maddie listened with total absorption, and then placed her small hands on the keys and began, with no instruction, to search for the notes by feel, the way some children simply can. And Henry stood in the doorway of the school hall and watched his daughter at a piano for the first time, and Grace saw, from across the room, the precise moment when his grief and his joy met and became the same thing. She went to him. She simply crossed the room and stood beside him in the doorway and put her arm around his waist, and he pulled her close against his side, and they stood there together watching Maddie discover the piano, and no words were needed, and none were attempted. October came, and with it the first frost and the blue wood smoke of autumn hearth fires rising all over Redemption Creek, and Henry Boone asked Grace Talbot to marry him on a Sunday morning in the Red Rock Hills, with the frost still white on the north-facing slopes, and the Texas sky an impossible clear blue overhead. He had thought about how to do it. She could tell he had thought about it, that he had considered the gesture carefully and weighed it against what he knew of her. He did not get on one knee, which she later told him she was glad of, because she would have felt the formality as a distance. Instead, he stopped his horse at the top of the Red Rock Ridge, and she stopped hers beside him, and they looked out over the enormous valley below, with the creek a silver thread through its center, and the town a small cluster of purpose in the wide land, and he said, "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you." "I know," she said. "You've been thinking for a while." "Is that obvious?" "Only because I know you," Grace said. Henry looked out at the valley. "I'm not going to tell you that you complete something," he said. "I don't think that's the right frame. You were already complete when you rode into Redemption Creek with your carpetbag and your precise language and your absolute refusal to need anyone to manage your affairs for you." A pause. "I'm not asking you to complete me either. I think I've done most of that work myself, slowly, badly, but genuinely." He turned to look at her. "I'm asking if you want to build something. Not because we need it, but because we'd be good at it, together. Because I think what we'd make between us would be worth making." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "I love you, Grace. I think I have since the morning you made eggs from the burned beans and didn't make me feel foolish about it." Grace laughed, and it was the fullest laugh, and then her eyes were bright and she said, "I love you too, Henry Boone. I have since you told me that protecting me wasn't a strategy." "It wasn't," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why." "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said. "Obviously, yes." He kissed her there on the ridge, with the cold morning air around them and the valley below and the enormous sky, and Grace Talbot felt, with the full precision of a woman who has been paying very careful attention to the nature of solid ground, that this was it. This was the real thing. Not the trap of Edmund Marsh's calculated warmth. Not the comfortable anesthesia of belonging to someone who needed you for practical reasons. This was chosen. This was seen. This was built on the honest record of two people who had both, in their different ways, learned what happened when you ignored the signals, and had decided, deliberately with open eyes, not to do that again. They rode back down into town with the morning fully bright around them, and when they came into the yard, Maddie was feeding General and looked up, and something in their faces told her what she needed to know, because she simply said, "Finally," with the gravity of a small prophet whose prediction has at last been fulfilled. And Eli, emerging from the barn with a handful of oats for the horses, looked at his father and at Grace and then at the sky and said, "Good," with the satisfaction of someone who has been computing the probability of this outcome for some time. They were married in the Redemption Creek Methodist Church on the first Saturday of November 1882, in a ceremony attended by most of the town and presided over by Reverend Arthur Mills, who was brief and warm and did not moralize, for which Grace was deeply grateful. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that she and the general store seamstress had made together, and Henry wore his good black coat and a new shirt, and Maddie was so earnest in her role as flower scatterer that she carpeted the entire aisle with late autumn blooms with a thoroughness that made the assembled congregation laugh. Harold Watts had provided the wedding supper, a community affair held in the school hall, and Mrs. Rodriguez had made her tamales, and there was dancing until late, fiddle music from a farmer named Webb who had a light touch and a repertoire that went from sweet to lively with ease. Henry danced with Grace twice, and both times she was struck by the fact that he danced the way he did, everything deliberate and attentive, not showy but present, fully there, his eyes on her face the whole time. "You're a good dancer," she said during the second one. "Margaret taught me," he said, without the shadow she had expected. It was simply a fact cleanly held. She said a man who won't learn to dance is a man who's afraid to be seen. She was right, Grace said. She often was, Henry said. "I think she'd like you." Grace leaned against him just briefly, her forehead to his shoulder. "I hope so," she said. They went home that night to the farm that was now Grace's home, not just in practice but in truth. And the children were asleep in the wagon under a blanket, and Henry carried Eli in, and Grace carried Maddie. And they put the children in their beds with the ease of people who have been doing this together for much longer than they actually have. And then they stood in the hallway between the children's rooms, and Henry took Grace's face in his hands and said, "Welcome home, Grace Boone." Grace tried out the sound of it in her mind. Grace Boone. She had kept Talbot through the years because her father's name was worth carrying, and she thought about that for a moment, about the father who had believed in her and the name he had given her. She would keep Talbot too, she decided. Grace Talbot Boone, both of them, both of her histories, the one that had hurt her and the one she was building. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Henry kissed her in the hallway with the house quiet around them and the November wind moving at the windows and the lamp burning low on the table. And it was different from all the other kisses, richer and deeper, and carrying the full weight of everything that had preceded it. Every careful moment and every honest word and every night on the porch under the enormous sky. They were very happy. The happiness was not simple, because happiness built on real ground never is. It had texture and weather and required attention. Henry still had mornings when the grief returned with an unexpected intensity, and Grace had learned not to manage those mornings for him, but to be present in them, steady and near. Grace had dreams sometimes in which she was back in Edmund Marsh's office, watching her father's letters lay on the mahogany desk. And she would wake with the old cold anger, and Henry would be awake too, because he had learned her in sleep as well as waking, and he would simply hold her without asking until the anger dissolved back into the past where it belonged. Eli grew taller through that winter, and his serious investigation of the natural world expanded to include, inspired by a visiting speaker at the schoolhouse, the question of whether the drought patterns of West Texas could be predicted by studying plant growth cycles, a project that Henry encouraged with resources and Grace encouraged with the methodology she had learned watching her father work, the habit of recording, the discipline of evidence. Maddie took piano lessons from Miss Porter every Saturday and progressed with the swiftness of a child who had been waiting for the instrument to arrive in her life rather than the other way around. And by February, she could play 3 complete hymns with both hands and had begun, on her own initiative, to compose small pieces that she called her thinking music, and played them in the evenings while Henry and Grace sat together at the long table, and the lamplight moved against the blue-checked curtains. In March, Grace knew she was pregnant. She told Henry on a Sunday morning before the children were awake, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the east window, and his face did something she had not quite seen it do before. A full, unguarded, undefended joy that seemed to start from somewhere deep inside him and work its way outward until it had claimed his whole face and his whole posture in both his hands, which he placed on her face and then on her shoulders and then could not decide where to put because there was too much feeling to hold still. "Henry," she said, laughing. "Grace," he said, and pulled her close and held her there for a long time without speaking. They told the children at breakfast. Maddie processed the information for approximately 7 seconds and then said, with the expression of someone whose long-range planning has been vindicated, "I would like a brother." "That is not how it works," Eli said. "It might work," Maddie said stubbornly. "The biology doesn't account for preference," Eli said. "Maybe mine does," Maddie said. Henry looked at Grace over both their heads and his eyes were bright, and she thought, as she often did, that the thing she loved most about this man was his capacity to be fully present in his own life, the way he never half attended anything, not his children, not his land, not her, not this moment at the breakfast table while his children argued about the biology of preference, and the spring light came through the east window. The summer of 1883 was the summer Grace published her first article. She had been writing for months, building the habit in the evenings after the children were asleep, and she had sent a piece on the subject of property rights for women on the frontier to a paper in Austin. The editor wrote back 3 weeks later saying he would publish it and asking if she had anything else. She had quite a lot else. Henry read each piece before she sent it, not as an editor but as a reader and partner, and his particular quality of attention, that same fully present listening she had first noticed on the porch in April, made his responses invaluable. He told her when an argument needed strengthening, and when a sentence was doing more work than it could carry, and he told her what moved him, and she found that knowing what moved him was useful both professionally and personally. The article was published in July, under the byline Grace Talbot Boone. Harold Watts displayed a copy in the window of the general store for a week. Mrs. Rodriguez said it ought to be sent to every woman she knew. Miss Porter read it to the older students in school, as an example of clear argumentation. Cal Draper, who Grace heard had read it through to the end in the barber shop and then put it down without a word, which she considered the most satisfying review she received. On a hot August night, their son was born. The birth was hard, as most births were in 1883 in a farmhouse in Texas with the county doctor present and nothing beyond skill and endurance to work with. And Henry held Grace's hand through the whole of it with the same steady presence he brought to everything. And when it was done and the doctor placed the child in Grace's arms and said, "A boy, Mrs. Boone, healthy and loud," Henry Boone, who did not cry easily, had tears on his face and made no effort to hide them. They named him Samuel Robert Boone, Samuel for Henry's father and Robert for Grace's. Mattie held her brother the following morning with the reverence of someone who has been confirmed in a long-held theological position, and said with deep satisfaction, "I told Eli." "You said, brother," Eli confirmed, sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands clasped between his knees and an expression of genuine wonder. "I don't know how you knew." "I just did," Mattie said simply. Henry sat on the edge of the bed with Grace's hand in his and Samuel between them, small and astonishing, and the September morning light came through the east window of the room that had once been only the room Grace had come to ask about, and was now the room where their son had been born, and Henry looked at Grace with that deep, undefended, fully present gaze and said, "This is what I meant." "What did you mean?" Grace asked, though she knew. "Something worth building," he said. "This." Grace looked at her husband and her son, and at the doorway where Eli and Mattie stood, these two children who had opened a door to a stranger with the certainty of people who had been waiting, who had known before any adult had the courage to know. She thought about the moment she had stood on that warped porch with the April wind pulling at her gray dress, asking about a room, and the way that moment had contained everything that followed, the way the first note of Mattie's thinking music contained the whole composition in potential form. She had come to ask about a room. She had found a life. Samuel grew with the demanding vitality of healthy babies in good homes, and by the following spring he was a presence in the household so fully established that it seemed impossible to remember the texture of the house before him. He was loud and determined, and had Henry's stubbornness in pure early form and Grace's clarity of purpose, which in a baby expressed itself as a fierce, unapologetic certainty about what he wanted, and when he wanted it. Eli, at 11, was beginning to correspond with a professor at the University of Texas at Austin about his plant drought studies, a development that Henry had encouraged and Grace had helped formalize, writing the initial letter on Eli's behalf in language precise enough to be taken seriously. The professor had written back with genuine interest and had sent 3 books, which Eli treated with the reverence appropriate to objects of great significance. Mattie played the piano at the school's winter recital in December of 1883 and performed her own composition, a 2-minute piece she called "The Creek in April." And Miss Porter said afterward, privately to Grace, that in 20 years of teaching she had never had a student with an ear like that one. Henry expanded the farm that year, buying 20 additional acres to the north that gave him better access to winter grazing, and Grace, who had been building a small practice of correspondence-based legal advising for women in the county who could not otherwise access counsel, found herself with more work than she could comfortably manage in the evenings alone. She and Henry discussed it one night at the long table and reached the decision that she would reduce her hours at the general store to mornings only, freeing her afternoons for the advisory work. Harold Watts accepted this with the pragmatic good grace of a man who had understood from the beginning that Grace Talbot Boone was not going to remain in general store accounts forever. In the spring of 1884, 2 years after Grace had first stood on that porch with a carpetbag and $47, Judge Anita Flores asked Grace if she would consider joining the county's newly formed Women's Property Rights Committee, a state-level initiative that was attempting to formalize the protections that Texas law technically offered but practically ignored. Grace discussed it with Henry. "It means some travel," she said. "Austin, probably. A few days at a time." "We'll manage," Henry said. "The children," Grace hesitated. "Are my children," Henry said simply. "And they love you fiercely, but they were raised. They know how to be without someone for a few days. You raised Eli to be competent, and you've raised Maddie to be competent, and Samuel is 13 months old and attaches himself to everything equally, so he'll be fine." Grace smiled. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about the fact that you have a particular gift," Henry said, "and that gift belongs to more people than just us. I have always known that about you." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not a man who would ask you to make yourself smaller to fit a smaller life. You know that." She did know that. She had known it from the porch conversations in the spring and the market square and the long table in the evenings and every moment between. "I know that," she said. "I just like to hear it." Henry raised an eyebrow. "You're very precise about things you don't actually need precision for." "I am," Grace agreed. "It's a character trait." He kissed her, and it was the kiss of 2 years of morning light and burned beans and piano music and red rock hills and an enormous Texas sky. And Grace Talbot Boone held onto her husband in the kitchen of the house she had come to ask about a room in, and felt, with the full weight of honest reckoning, the breadth and depth of what she had found here. Not just shelter, not just safety, not just the practical geography of a new beginning. A partner, a builder beside her. A man who had waited because she had needed him to wait, and then stepped forward without hesitation when she had been ready, and who had never once tried to be the architect of her life when it was her own to design. The committee work took her to Austin 4 times that year and once to San Antonio, and each time she returned to the farm and the house and the long table, Maddie would play the latest piece she had been working on as a form of welcome, and Eli would produce whatever project he was developing for her review, and Samuel would grab her skirt and hold on with both hands and refuse to be put down for the better part of an evening. And Henry would have supper on the table and the coffee already made, and he would look at her with those tired and warm and fully present eyes and say something plain like, "Good to have you home," and it would carry everything. By the autumn of 1884, Grace knew she was pregnant again, and she told Henry in the same kitchen, in the same early morning light, and he pulled her close in the same way. And this time, she felt the difference of 2 years of accumulated certainty in the quality of his arms around her. The committee published its first report in December, with Grace credited as a primary author, and it was received by the state legislature with the cautious interest of institutions that know change is coming and are deciding how far ahead of it they can afford to get. Judge Flores wrote Grace a letter calling the report the most clearly argued document she had received from a non-lawyer, to which Grace replied that she had been raised by one, which she thought explained everything. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1885, and they named her Clara Rose Boone, Clara for Henry's mother and Rose because Maddie had lobbied for a flower name with the same single-minded effectiveness she brought to all her important projects. Samuel, at 20 months, regarded his new sister with the suspicion appropriate to a person who has been the youngest for what he considered an adequate period of time. And then, in the way of small children who are loved and secure, adapted entirely within a week and became, by general consensus, the most enthusiastic older brother in Redemption Creek. Eli, at 12, held Clara with the careful seriousness of a young scientist encountering a phenomenon he found simultaneously familiar and newly significant, and said to Grace afterward with genuine wonder, "She has your eyes." Grace laughed. "You think so?" "The color," Eli said, "and the way they're looking at everything. Like they're taking notes." Grace held her son, this boy who had been a solemn stranger opening a door 2.5 years ago and was now entirely hers, and said, "She'll have to take notes. The world is complicated and interesting and requires good notes." Eli nodded gravely. "I keep mine in the ledger you gave me." "I know," Grace said. "I've read some of them." Eli considered this. "Did you have notes on my father?" Grace looked at her boy. "Not written notes," she said. "But yes, I had notes." "And the notes were positive?" Eli asked, with the precise, slightly anxious curiosity of a child asking about something that matters immensely to them. "The notes were very positive," Grace said. "From very early on." Eli accepted this with the satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis and went back to his drought study calculations. That summer, Henry taught Eli to properly grade a field drainage channel, standing out in the sun with his boy in a level and a length of twine. And Grace sat on the porch with Clara in her arms and watched her husband teaching her son the geometry of water and land. And Maddie sat beside her playing The Creek in April on the small harmonica she had recently added to her musical repertoire, because Miss Porter had told her that a genuine musician learns all instruments. And Samuel ran in circles in the yard, because, at 2 years old, running in circles was a fully adequate use of an afternoon. Grace looked at the farm, at the water oak grove north of the house, and the silver thread of the creek and the red rock hills against the Texas sky, and she thought about ground, about what ground meant when you had been standing on false ground for long enough that you had forgotten what solid felt like. She thought about the $47 and the carpetbag, and the scrap of paper with the name Boone Farm on it, pressed into her palm by a station master in Abilene who had simply thought she would be safe here. Safe? She had come looking for safe. She had found so much more than safe. She had found children who opened a door like they had been waiting. A man who waited with a patience that came not from passivity but from respect. A town that had gradually, with the ordinary magic of community, become the place whose name she gave when people asked where she was from. Work that mattered and a voice that was being heard in rooms that needed the kind of precision she had built from wreckage. She had found in the most unexpected geography the fullest version of herself. Henry came up to the porch in the late afternoon, leaving Eli to finish the channel calculations he had assigned him, and sat beside Grace and looked at their daughter sleeping in her arms and their son orbiting the yard, and listened to Maddie's harmonica, and let the evening settle around them with the ease of a man who is entirely at home in his own life. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the station master in Abilene," Grace said. Henry looked at her. "He told me you take in boarders sometimes," Grace said. "He said I'd be safe here. He pressed your name on a piece of paper like it was a favor." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Do you think it was?" "I think it was the most consequential piece of paper anyone ever pressed into my hand," Grace said, "including all my father's legal documents, which is saying something." Henry smiled, that quiet, slightly dry smile she had loved from the first time she had seen it crack his careful face. "I almost didn't put the sign out," he said. "I'd been thinking about it for months. Margaret's sister in Missouri wrote and said I should take in a boarder. It would be good for the children to have another adult in the house. I kept arguing with the idea." He paused. "I put the sign out 3 days before you arrived. Eli saw me nail it to the fence post and asked me why I was doing it when I never had before." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't entirely know," Henry said. "That sometimes you make a decision before you understand the reason for it." Grace looked at him sidelong. "And do you understand the reason now?" Henry turned to look at her fully, the way he always did when he was saying something he meant with his entire self. "You were coming," he said simply. "I think some part of me knew that, and so I put the sign out." Grace considered the strangeness of that, the mystery of it, the way Maddie had said "I dreamed about you," and the way two small children had opened a door with the certainty of people welcoming someone expected. The way nothing about her arrival in Redemption Creek had felt accidental from the moment she had stood on that porch with the April wind at her hem. She had been a woman with a dark past and a deliberate plan and a fierce determination not to need anyone. She had knocked on a door, and the children had answered it like they had been waiting. And the man behind the door had been the kind of man who put a sign out before he understood why, and waited with patience and respect and the willingness to build something worth building, and none of it had been a trap or a hidden motive or a forced choice or a betrayal. It had been, for the first time in a very long time, exactly what it appeared to be. Henry took her hand, his thumb moving over her knuckles, and Clara slept in her arms, and Maddie played her harmonica, and Samuel ran his circles, and the Texas evening came down over the farm in its enormous, ordinary splendor. "I love you," Grace said. "I know," Henry said. "I love you too." Not because they had to say it. Because they wanted to. Because it was true and they had both decided to say true things. The years that followed were the years of a life genuinely, fully lived. Eli went to the University of Texas at Austin at 17, with a letter of recommendation from the professor he had been corresponding with since he was 11, carrying the drought study ledger and a trunk packed by Grace with the same methodical care she brought to everything. He came home for summers and Christmas, and grew into a young man with his father's jaw and Grace's precise manner of speaking, and a particular combination of their two temperaments that was entirely his own, curious and principled and capable of a deep, steady warmth that he expressed in the same quiet way Henry expressed everything important. Maddie was accepted to a music conservatory in Houston at 16 and spent 3 years there learning what Miss Porter had always told her she needed to learn, and came home playing compositions that made the family sit perfectly still at the long table and simply listen. She performed at the Austin Opera House at 20, and Henry and Grace went together and sat in the second row, and Grace held Henry's hand through the entire performance and felt the quality of his emotion beside her, the pride of a father whose daughter has become everything she was always going to become. Samuel grew into a boy with his father's love of the land and his mother's stubbornness about the right thing, and at 13, he organized his classmates into a petition to the county school board, requesting that the school's curriculum include the history of the indigenous peoples of Texas, with the same seriousness afforded to European settlement history, and submitted the petition with the formal correctness of someone who had grown up watching a woman demonstrate that a well-argued document could move institutions. Clara grew into herself with the steadiness of the well-loved, curious and brave, and possessed of Grace's exacting eye for what was real and what was performance. She loved horses and hated injustice, and had, from a very young age, a gift for seeing to the center of people that reminded Henry of Maddie, and reminded Grace of no one she had known before, which meant it was entirely Clara's own. In 1891, 9 years after Grace Talbot had arrived on the porch of Henry Boone's farm with a carpetbag, and a plan that had not accounted for any of this, the Redemption Creek County Recorder's Office filed a document of title recording the farm under the name Boone, Henry and Grace Talbot, jointly, a legal formality that meant little in practice since the farm had been Grace's as surely as it had been Henry's from the day she had stopped being a boarder and become a builder, but which Grace had wanted on the official record because she believed in the record. She filed it herself, walked into the recorder's office on a Tuesday morning and placed it on the desk and watched it signed and stamped and entered. She had learned from her father that you protect what you build by putting it in writing. She had learned from Henry that you build it by being honest and present and patient. She had learned from the children, from Eli and Maddie and Samuel and Clara, that the most important things are sometimes already known by people who have not yet been told to doubt them. who open doors to strangers with the certainty of welcome, who say I dreamed about you with the simple confidence of small people who have not yet learned to mistrust their own deep knowledge. She had come to ask about a room. She had been given everything. The farmhouse in the autumn of 1891 was different from the farmhouse she had arrived in. Fuller, louder in the good way. The long oak table was the same table, and the blue-checked curtains were the same curtains, replaced twice now with the same fabric because Mattie had insisted on the same pattern. The brass-framed bed was still in the east room, which was now the room she and Henry shared, and the window still faced the morning. Grace sat on the porch one evening in October, the same porch, the same swing Henry had built and hung the summer after they married, and watched the last of the sunset go red over the red rock hills, and Henry came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her in the way of a man who has sat beside the same person in the same place for years and finds it still the best available location in any room or any landscape. Eli's letter came today, Grace said. He's publishing the drought study in the university journal. I know, Henry said. I read it twice. Of course you did, Grace said. They were quiet for a while, the comfortable silence they had always been good at, deeper now with the depth of years layered into it. I was thinking about the first day, Henry said after a while. What about it? Grace asked. Mattie told me that morning that someone was coming, Henry said. I told her that was her imagination. He paused. She looked at me with that particular look she had, the one that meant she was right and I would find out eventually. Grace smiled. She still has that look. She does, Henry agreed, and she's still usually right. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture he had made in the dark on the wagon ride home from the Harwick Fair, 9 years ago now, a gesture so familiar it had become like breathing. I put the sign out 3 days before you came, he said again. Do you ever think about that? I think about it all the time, Grace said. What do you make of it? Grace considered the question with the full weight of her precision. The dark past and the betrayal and the westbound train, and the name on the scrap of paper, and the warped porch and the April wind, and the door swinging open, and the children's waiting faces, and the man with the tired eyes and the good hands, and the patience of someone who had been standing at the right place long enough. I make of it, she said slowly, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is knock on a door you didn't plan to knock on and tell the truth about what you need. Henry turned to look at her, that same full, fully present gaze, not diminished by 9 years of daily proximity but deepened by it, the way good things deepen. And what did you need? He asked. A room, Grace Talbot Boone said, and smiled at her husband in the last of the October light. Just a room. Henry squeezed her hand. The stars came out over Texas one by one, the familiar constellations of a sky that had watched all of it, the arrival and the waiting and the choosing and the building. And the house behind them was full of the sounds of a life well and honestly made. And Grace Talbot Boone sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and was, in the fullest and most precisely measured sense of the word, home.